So in this chapter, we're essentially seeing the end of 3 storylines. The end of Tomura Shigaraki's, the end of Spinner's, and the end of Overhaul's, which is surprising. But the opening of this chapter, we see people on the television like getting interviewed about Shigaraki and his legacy, essentially. And everybody's like, yeah, he was a terrible person. He was awful. You know, he killed a bunch, destroyed even more. And it also eventually gets to the point of where they start revealing that he did have a tragic backstory, or a tragic past, as they say, you know, because he started off innocent as Tenko Shimura, and then of course eventually becoming Shigaraki by being manipulated by All for One. And yeah, that doesn't really excuse what he did. I mean, even in real life, when we look at, villains, quote unquote, or people that do really bad things, and it's revealed, oh, they had a really crappy upbringing, or their parents were awful, or their situation was awful, we still don't forgive them. It's kind of like a tricky situation. But Izuku eventually comes to Spinner's hospital / jail that he's at, because before Shigaraki died, he told Izuku hey, tell Spinner that to the bitter end, Tomura Shigaraki kept fighting to destroy. And that was the only request that he made to Izuku, essentially. And the way that Izuku is, he's gonna have to do it. So once he gets there, we find out that not only is Spinner alive, but he's gonna be okay, I guess, because, last we saw him in the war, we found out that All for One had forcibly given him 2 extra quirks. One that makes him big, and one that gives him scale armor. And because of that, his brain couldn't handle having multiple quirks, and he was becoming a Nomu. That's why he was freaking out and foaming from the mouth and everything when he was fighting against Shoji. But apparently they were able to save him from going fully Nomu, or at least the Toad doctor says that thanks to the research on the Nomus they were conducting, they were able to stop him from fully transforming. So Spinner's going to be okay, and it even seems like he's able to retain his 2 extra quirks. He can get big and get the scale stuff, because he freaks out on Izuku here when he's talking about Shigaraki. But I guess he can just go back to normal, and he's alright, I guess. But Izuku relays to him what Shigaraki said, and Spinner's confused. He's why would he say that? And then he goes on to explain how Shigaraki was his role model, essentially, the one person that he looked up to the most, which we knew. And it was kind of a genuine friendship that they had, for sure. I really wish that Horikoshi would have explored this aspect more than he did, because it's only a handful of panels that we really see their bromance, quote unquote. It would have been better, at least in my opinion, if they showed more extended scenes with them talking and bonding, and just honestly getting to know more of these characters, because when we do get to know Shigaraki, it's more so about his tragic backstory and how it's, messed him up as a person. We actually got the most into him, just as a person, I guess, what his interests are and everything, in the first season, when he's still in his quote-unquote man-child mode. And I guess just later on throughout the series, and especially now, when Spinner just talks about Shigaraki and who he is, pretty much outside of being a dastardly villain, I guess. Because he's yeah, he allowed me to dream. It felt like something big was about to happen. He was my hero. He also loved video games just like I did. And he also found out that, the game that he really liked as a kid, it was the same game that they played, because he would always be stuck inside because of being a heteromorph. Spinner experienced a lot of prejudice growing up because of the way that he looked. And Shigaraki was the first person who just saw past that, and as Spinner says, it was the first friend he ever had. But first, let's talk about the sponsor of this video, Hofsco, because I just picked up their Hov Alpha 26-inch electric fat tire bike, and this thing is absolutely incredible. It's probably my favorite possession. Just looking at it, it's incredibly aesthetic, but it also has a 1300 watt motor with a high capacity integrated battery that gives you a range of up to 80 miles per charge. It also has a max speed of 28 miles per hour, as well as a 450 pound payload capacity, along with an intuitive LCD digital panel, front suspension, hydraulic disc brakes, a Shimano 7-speed shifter, a headlight and a tail light, as well as a solid aluminum crankset. It also has this really cool thumb throttle that allows you to just cruise without having having to pedal. Like I said, this thing is incredible. I feel so safe on the road with it, and it's so powerful. It easily blasts through hills and incline and goes through rough terrain and the forest like it's nothing. That's one of the main reasons why I wanted to get it, because it's kind of difficult to go through trails and unpaved roads with traditional bikes. I also don't own a car, considering that I live downtown in the city. I don't have to deal with like car insurance and parking and mechanics and any of that stuff. You just get around no problem with this bad boy. So guys, you can get your very own HAV Alpha 26-inch electric fat tire bike by checking the link in the description. Thanks, guys. And it goes back to Shigaraki saying, on his deathbed, like, I needed to be a hero for those guys. Like, they deserve to have heroes too. Like, even the villains and the underprivileged, I guess you could say. Going forward into this conversation, it says, like, bear in mind that another Shigaraki / All For One could be hiding from us as we speak, and we have to keep the eye on the next big threat. And Spinner's like, oh, you people, you'll keep fighting? You'll eventually forget Shigaraki. You'll forget the League of Villains, so I'll write a book. And before I go more into that, just it being mentioned that there might be another All For One Shigaraki out there hiding from us as we speak, that was like the second time that was mentioned in the last 3 chapters. And I think that character that we saw like 2 chapters ago, I think it was, or was it the previous chapter? I think it might have been 2 chapters ago, when we saw like that villain-esque looking person crying, walking through like the destroyed streets. They're probably like the next quote-unquote Shigaraki / All For One, and we're going to see a resolution to that very quickly, considering that there are only 3 chapters left after this. But ending this sequence, Spinner essentially goes on to say that he's just going to be spreading the gospel of Shigaraki for the rest of his life. And Izuku says, hey, you should make it a comic, which I guess is like a callback to how everything started, with the Oichi and All For One like basing everything they've done off of comics, essentially. But after this, we see the resolution of Overhaul's storyline, where yes, he's still in prison, armless, and the Yakuza boss, who like raised Overhaul essentially, finally wakes up. We found out like in his arc that he did something to the Yakuza boss with his quirk to like put him in a coma, and he was kind of keeping him there as like a prisoner, I guess. But they woke him up somehow with support gear or something. I guess it was the doing of like Tsukauchi and All Might. Also, this Yakuza boss guy is like the grandfather of Eri. Not that it really matters, because it's not like she's going to go back into his custody or anything, but basically this boils down to the Yakuza boss saying like, hey Overhaul, you're a failure, you suck, the Yakuza are no longer a thing, or at least the Shihaya Sakai, like he disbanded it, and he's like, yeah, you strayed away from humanity. And it's like, it's too late for saying sorry. You should be apologizing to Eri for the rest of your life. Like, she'll eventually forget about you, but you can't forget about what you did to her. And it's like, I don't know if she's going to forget about that. That trauma's going to go deep forever, unfortunately. But then he's just saying like, yeah, no need to worry. I'll be here chewing you out until the day I die. Which I guess is somewhat of a fitting punishment for Overhaul, even though he's just straight up get the death penalty. But it is what it is, I guess. Also kind of paralleling to the fate that Endeavor and Dabi have, where they're going to be visiting each other until they die, or at least until Dabi dies, which I guess will be relatively soon. But yeah, that's the end of Overhaul. He's just in prison forever, and the Yakuza boss, who he loves the most, is just going to tell him that he's crappy until he dies. And then coming to the very end of the chapter, we see that the first years are entering UA, the new first years, considering, the class that we've been following. They've been class 1A and 1B for the entirety of the series up until like the last arc or so, where they're now officially second years. So now we have the new freshmen, the new first years. And since there's only 3 chapters left, I doubt we're really going to get too much into these characters, unfortunately, but there's so much potential for them. All these new characters and quirks and their own personalities and aesthetics and everything. I mean, I'm sure we'll see some of them, because we actually see some of the girls, at least, at the end of this chapter, and they're all like fangirling over Bakugo and Shoto, because they're essentially famous at this point, considering, the coverage that the final war had and their inclusions into those wars. Like, they won the war because of the big 3 here, like Shoto, Bakugo, and Izuku. If they didn't have them, then we would have lost for sure. I say we, the good guys. But yeah, I guess we're going to get into some of the freshman stuff. And then we also need to find out what happened to Toga, whether she lived or died. And then we need to have the resolution between Izuku and Uraraka. And then we need to see Izuku's dad. When's that happening? But yeah, that's pretty much it for this one. Let me know what you thought about this chapter in the comments. And if you liked it, please give it a like. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one.